What makes the achievement of emotional sobriety so difficult is the habits we have, the patterns we have in our behavior, the habitual ways that we've come to think about things. We have to really become aware of those things in order to challenge them, because the consciousness that has created a lot of the problems in our life cannot solve it, cannot change things. So what happens is the first step is waking up. The meeting now for the last 40 some sessions has been focusing on the 12 steps and how they help us achieve emotional sobriety. So what I want to do today is to stop and just kind of review what we've done so far. Now, it was very, very clear that in 1950, Bill realized that if we work these steps in our daily lives, that we and those about us begin to achieve emotional sobriety. So Bill was very explicit in stating that the goal of recovery is first physical sobriety and then emotional sobriety. And we've been unpacking for quite some time now how the steps help us achieve that. Now, the way that we've been thinking about it is that we've been using a term, and I want to define it further tonight, called differentiation. Differentiation is another way of talking about, or synonymous with, talking about emotional maturity. We will be using emotional sobriety is synonymous with emotional maturity and with differentiation. Other terms that relate to emotional sobriety are like emotional autonomy, freedom, emotional freedom, I think, is another way of thinking about. True independence of spirit is a phrase that Bill Wilson used to describe emotional sobriety. Now, what is this maturity? How are we maturing? Well, in the letter that Brian was reading in the beginning of it, when Bill's talking about it, he talks about real maturity and balance in our life. Well, what is the nature of that balance that we're talking about? Well, as some of you have heard, if you were in the room before we started the meeting, I did a workshop on Sunday in Lambertville, New Jersey. And in preparing for the workshop, I was doing some further reading on Dr. Murray Bowen's work on differentiation. And I came across a statement that I had never seen before from him. And I want to read that to you. And maybe somebody can even write this down into the chat room so people can refer to it as we talk tonight. That Bowen described differentiation as the amount of variation. So it's the amount of variation in one's ability to act for oneself without being selfish. So the amount of variation in one's ability to act for oneself without being selfish, while being able to act for others without being selfless. So I'll say that again. The variation in our ability to act for ourselves without being selfish, while also being able to act for others without being selfless. Now, that sounds paradoxical. And it sounds that way because it is quite paradoxical. We're acting for ourselves, but we're not acting selfishly. We're acting for others, but we're not acting selflessly. You see, that's the balance point. And so when I can hold on to myself and at the same time stay connected to you and respect you, then I'm being differentiated. I'm honoring you and I'm honoring me. Well, this is something that none of us knew how to do before taking this journey in terms of raising our differentiation or growing ourselves up. And the journey started with step one. We started to now, because Bill said we need to have a lot of humility to achieve this. And the humility meaning I need to let go of what I think I know about life and now open myself up to some other possibilities that there may be a better way for me to think about myself, to think about my relationships with others, to think about my relationship with life itself. And that's the journey we've been on as we're working the steps. We talked about powerlessness in step one. We admitted our powerlessness over alcohol. If you're an NA, it's over your addiction, and then while that was or maybe for some of us, our first experience with humility in our lives, is then the second half of that step, which is that our lives had become unmanageable. Well, that had far-reaching implications in terms of that the way that I've approached my life, meaning trying to control things, created unmanageability. And it's a paradox. The more I try to control, the more things are out of control. That's what we come to realize. And then in step two, what we said is that what happens in one step creates a charge and energy that is then resolved or discharged in the second step. I've got this problem, this serious problem. It's an existential crisis. The way I'm living doesn't work, but I don't have anything to replace it with. I don't have a better solution. That's the existential crisis created in step one, and it's resolved in step two, that we get hope, that there is a better way. There is a way that I don't know much about yet, but there is a possibility for a new experience in life. And that's why I love defining recovery as the discovery of new possibilities. And that's the idea of hope, that there is the possibility of discovering some new ways of being able to live, new ways of being in relationship to myself, my relationship with you, and my relationship with my experiences in life. That's the hope that gets generated in step two, which is so powerful. Because now that while that resolves an existential crisis, it creates another charge. My God, how is this going to happen? I want that in my life. I want that to happen. And that's where step three comes in, is we make a commitment to now pursuing this new way of life. We make a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood him. So we turn our lives over to the possibility that there's another way of doing these things. And now I'm going to make a commitment to pursue and to try to find out as much as I can about how to create that experience in my life. First three steps form the foundation of our recovery. Now, that charge that's developed in step three is now I've made this commitment. Now I've got to get into action. What do I need to do? Well, step four comes along, make an inventory, right? Make a searching and fearless moral inventory of ourselves, right? And so we sit down and we start to get honest with ourselves, maybe for the first time in our life, that we sit down and take a serious look at who we are. And as I've said to you before, only the best in us can see the worst in us. And that's what we're doing, is now we're starting to take a look at ourselves. We're starting to understand, well, what's going on? What is happening with me? How am I showing up in life? What are some of these forces that I'm being lived by? See, that's what we want to pay attention to, is we're increasing our awareness, because emotional sobriety involves bringing a full awareness, a higher level of consciousness to our lives. And that's what we're starting to do at step four. So we make this inventory. We're sitting there now with all of these experiences of ourselves and these things we're seeing about ourselves. We're building up this charge. The discharge is we share it with someone. I called that person our enlightened witness, right? We take and we share, with that other person, the exact nature of our wrongs. Right? And we start to look at what's really going on. And by sharing it with someone else, we start to see ourselves and even the things we've done from a different vantage point. And instead of just seeing ourselves as good or bad, we now have a deeper understanding that we were trying to find a way to ensure our existence, to ensure our centeredness in life. And that what we did, while we can call them character defects, it may be better to call them character defaults. It was the best solutions we could come up with at the time. And so now we get honest with that, and we see that that's not who we want to be, that the possibility we have is much greater than what we've been able to come up with or settle for. The compromises we've made, they may be unnecessary. And so now in step 6 and 7, we start to make that pivot towards becoming what we can be. Owning who we are to become what we can be. We pivot towards developing the best possible attitude towards ourselves and towards life, and towards our relationship with life itself and others. And we're told, okay, you're going to develop best possible attitude. The first thing is you got to take responsibility for yourself. You look at anybody that talks about mental health and talks about growth and development, it all starts with being responsible for oneself, taking responsibility. Nathaniel Branden, Roger and I are big fans of Nathaniel Branden and his work and his writings. He's passed away a number of years ago now, but he was prolific in terms of the books he's left us about this and the understanding he had. And he talks about taking responsibility as one of the 6 pillars of self-esteem in our life. And so we do that. We make a list of people we've harmed. We become willing to make amends to them. That's an act of I am preparing to take full responsibility for how I've showed up and how I've created my existence and the impact I've had on those people around me. Each of these steps are differentiating us more and more. We are becoming more aware of ourselves. We're becoming more aware of who we are. What are the forces that are running our lives, so that we can become aware of them and have better choices, so that we can get to this point where we can act for ourselves without being selfish, and we can act for others without losing ourselves or being selfless. That's the goal. So now, these last several weeks, we've been talking about step 9, making direct amends. And the differentiation here is huge, because we want to take responsibility for how we've shown up in these relationships, but not take responsibility for how someone else has coped with their feelings. We can be responsible to them for what we've done to them and for what they've had to deal with in our life, but how they've dealt with it is their business. That's where our responsibility ends. And we're trying to understand that, and we're trying to understand, well, then how do we make these amends? How do we go to someone, and what are we then making amends for? Well, the way that we've been discussing it, and please understand that this is just our opinions, the way that I think about this stuff. Roger will share his ways. Be critical about it, draw your own conclusions about this stuff. But to me, it would sound something like this. I am making amends for how I have shown up in another person's life, and for what that's done in terms of the challenges that's created for the other person. Now, I'm not responsible for how they dealt with those challenges. I'm responsible for creating those challenges, but they're responsible for how they coped with them. So when I'm making responsibility, when I'm going to them to make amends, I'm making amends for who I am and what that challenge that has created for their lives. Now, I can have empathy that I may have really created a huge challenge for you, by my behavior. If it was betrayal, or if I've broke a confidence in some way, or whatever I've done, disappointed someone in terms of promises I've made that were never fulfilled, or even what we talked about, the unusual suspects in terms of making amends, is putting all my emotional dependence on someone and expecting them to take care of me, and then making them, gaslighting them, or or making them feel like that they have really let me down, when the truth was I was just letting myself down. And it had nothing to do with them. I was making them responsible for what I wasn't taking responsibility for. And that's going to be a big theme in here, that I do to other people what I'm doing to myself. If I'm not taking responsibility for myself, I'll project that responsibility on you. I'm going to make you responsible. So we're growing up. That's what we're doing here in this program. That's what differentiation is about. It's the movement. It's transcending what we call environmental support, being totally dependent on what's happening in my environment for me to be okay, to now self-support, that it's my relationship to my experience that I'm responsible for, instead of expecting my environment to take care of me. Now, we all started this journey in this world completely dependent, on the person that had conceived us. But as soon as we're born, we start making that first step towards differentiation. And most of us were severely arrested at some point along the way and got stuck. And that's at the root of our unmanageability. And that's at the root of us becoming control freaks and expecting all these things from other people that we develop these unenforceable rules for, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So enough said about all that. I'm going to turn it over to Roger for a few minutes and he can comment, and then let's open this up about this journey and what it's meant for you and how you experience yourself in terms of your growth and development in the program so far.
Thank you, Al. I'm going to repeat that definition again because I really like it as well. Bowen's definition of differentiation. The amount of variation. And think about that part a little bit too, because that refers to flexibility, right? It refers to flexibility, ability to move one direction, the other, ability to flow is another way that I might put it in terms of this balance. And what is the balance again? It's variation in one's ability to act for oneself. And the way I think of that is to engage in good self-care, right? Healthy self-care. I talk about it for myself. And again, always imperfect in my life in terms of how well I do this. But it's how well I fulfill my obligation to take good care of this life I've been given, is how I think of it for myself a lot. So ability to act for oneself without being selfish. And I just love the simplicity of that. And act for others without acting selflessly. Every day, each day, I think explicitly about this principle as I'm going through my day, interacting with people, but I think about it especially when I come up against a spot that's difficult for me or challenging for me, because it's a very helpful way for me to think about my relationships, especially, but also my relationship to myself. Is how is my balance right now? Where am I in this variation? Am I leaving myself out of this situation altogether and showing no consideration for my own needs and my own feelings and my own values and goals? And totally surrendering to, Alan talked about, what are these forces I'm being lived by? I really like that expression. Being totally at the mercy of, possessed by, is we talk about, self-possession. And I think we do let some of these character defaults we've developed possess us. We identify with them, right? Or at least I do, whether it's my emotional dependency on the one hand, or on the other hand, my extreme self-centeredness, right? I can be lived by either one of those tendencies. So throughout my day, when I'm running into trouble at an emotional level, especially relationally speaking, I check in with myself about this. It has real pragmatic, practical value for me in that way? Am I leaning too much toward, acting on my own behalf? Is my slice of the pie 85% of the pie in this moment? Or am I making my concern and consideration for myself 5% of my consciousness in that moment, and my concern for the other person 95%? It doesn't mean that at times I don't need to act strongly in my own self-interest, or at times I may need to act very strongly in somebody else's interest, especially if it's a loved one or someone I really care about. It might be necessary for me to put myself in a situation where I put myself at risk emotionally, maybe even in some rare instances, put myself physically at risk. But that's not just about the other person, even in that moment, right? It's about my own values and the importance of that person to me. So I just wanted to make that point, that this way of conceptualizing ourselves and our relationships to others is, to me, a really practical, really useful way of thinking about life. The only other thing I really wanted to mention was, I had talked last week about in me making an amends to another person, how much of that is about me focusing on what my responsibility for my actions and the challenges, as Alan put that I put it, for them, and how much of it is about focusing on them. And do I demand that they respond in a certain way? And sometimes I may have that demand. And to me, the best way to handle that is not to pretend I don't, right? But the best way to handle it is to take ownership of that for myself and just say, I'm aware that when I said this to you, I had this expectation with you, that you would respond in a certain way, that you would appreciate the amends that I made to you, and so on. And rather than judge myself for that expectation, to me, one good way, it's not the only way by any means, to handle it is just to own it. I won't talk about you much, Brian, but I do want to say, I just want to give an example, because I see this a lot with Brian. When Alan commented to Brian at the start of the meeting about, are you letting people in? I wondered if you noticed how Brian responded. He just said, oh, I spaced out. I'll get back to it, get back on it. No defensiveness, no denial, no unnecessary apology. Just, oh, yeah, I spaced out. Now, that to me was an example of a real a really self-accepting response, right? And I love it when I see that kind of response embodied or presented. I love it when I'm able to respond in that way. I love it when other people are able to respond in that way. It's like, oh, yep, that's what happened. No big deal, right? No big deal. And then we just step in to take care of what needs to be taken care of. So going back to that issue about making demands, what I had said last week was, in that moment where I'm making a demand of a person to be in a certain way toward me or behave in a certain way toward me, I'm not allowing that person what I'm demanding for myself. In that demand, as I get, outraged about how they're treating me, and as I get all self-righteous and all upset, which I have absolutely been at times in my life, what am I not doing in that moment? I'm not aware that I'm not letting them be who they need to be in that moment, because I'm 100% focused on them being who I need them to be. Now, if I'm somebody who never makes requests of other people because I'm afraid to do so, because I'm afraid I might be told no or I might upset them, then it's really important for me to try to develop an ability to express what I want in a relationship and express what I need. If I'm somebody who's constantly insisting on what I want and constantly demanding of others what I want, then the balance needs to go in the other direction. So that's what I want to finish on. A lot of these principles, how we apply them depends on what we know about ourselves, right? How do we gain more flexibility, more choice, more freedom in our own life? And that hinges on knowing what my patterns are. So on that note, thanks, Al.
Yeah.
I will finish for tonight.
Yeah, no, great. I appreciate that. People say, can you give an example? But what I'd like to do is I just tie back into this step, right? Step number 9 is made direct amends to such people whenever possible or wherever possible, except when to do so would injure them or others. So we're doing exactly what Bowen said. We are now trying to take care of ourselves, but not selfishly. Meaning, if what I have to say is going to devastate someone else and they're not in a good place, I don't talk to them about bringing up a wound that they're maybe haven't resolved because they're in a bad place. Or if I go ahead and make this amends and they don't know about it, then I'm not going to bring something into their life that they're not aware of. So now I am not going to act selfishly to take care of myself. I'm honoring that other person. At the same time, I'm not being selfless because I am also wanting to take care of myself. And I'm not doing that because I want to respect the other person. So I'm holding both sides of that paradox. I'm taking care of myself without being selfish. And I'm now trying to take care of the other person without being selfless. I'm also honoring the fact that I want to show up in a way that is not going to re-injure them, and that's important for me. And so I'm not going to totally ignore what that means for me in the position that I put myself in or how I talk to somebody about it, but I'm going to have the awareness Roger talks about of myself and others. See, that's the balance again that we're looking for.
I'm so happy to hear you say that, Al, because there's so much confusion for myself at times in my own life. I know for people at this meeting, it matters what my ability to, my sense of where the other person's at and what their abilities are in that moment. That's going to impact, not because I'm responsible for how they respond to what I do to them, but I don't want to generate from my side a challenge where I know just in my gut or intuitively or cognitively or some combination of both that they're not in a place right now to deal with that. If I was where they are, I wouldn't be either.
Right.
Right.
And see, the selfless part I didn't articulate well. So when I go to make amends to the other person to try to make them whole, I'm doing that because it's good for me, not just because it's going to be good for them. See, that's the part where I'm not acting selflessly. I'm still involved in this, so I'm going to show up and do it. But I'm going to also do it with an awareness of the other person. Because if I make further injury, that's not what I'm trying to do here. I'm trying to get to my integrity, which means honoring the togetherness we have and also the separateness we have. Both of those two things. That's what I'm trying to hold the paradox of.
I hear a lot of people criticize the 12 steps that they're old-fashioned. I can understand that criticism. They were written back in 1935. Some people that are agnostic have difficulty with the word God used in the steps. For me, I look at the process that's involved. The forces that the 12 steps generate are so powerful that I think they're ageless. There's this interesting phenomena that happens when you work the steps. They create a charge and then a discharge. The first step, we're powerless. Our life has become unmanageable. It creates this charge. We're in big trouble and we don't know what to do. And then step 2 comes along and it says we have hope. That charge, that existential crisis that we have is resolved. What's happening here is parallel to life. We charge ourselves when we breathe in. When we exhale, we discharge. That's the rhythm of life. And the way I love to think about the 12 steps, it's helping us get connected to the rhythm of life so we can learn how to show up in a good way.